All right, everyone. For this week, we're going to be talking about biodiversity and environmental protection. And so for this screencast here, we'll kind of focus on deforestation in Latin America, which is a really big issue. It's also kind of my area of expertise in research. I research the connection between land conflict and deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, as I've mentioned before. And but land conflict's not the only thing. In fact, I'm not going to really talk about that much at all today, beyond just right now. Deforestation, though, can happen for a lot of different reasons. The picture here on the kind of title slide shows deforestation in a national forest in the Brazilian Amazon. That's actually also the site of one of the world's most productive bauxite mines. Now, bauxite's a mineral that we make aluminum out of. And this company is actually an international company controlled by Canadians, or a Canadian conglomerate. They actually have a license to do strip mining in a national forest, which is kind of interesting. But that'll bring up kind of the online written material, which connects kind of environmental change with environmental conservation. And there's more than one way to set up a national park. In fact, here in the U.S., even though we set up the first national parks in the world, our model is definitely not the only model or even the best model for other countries. But before we really dig in, I wanted to talk a little bit about just kind of citation sources and plagiarism. I haven't really read through people's draft papers yet. I've received a couple of them, and we'll get them back to you within a week. But there's some info that you should just be aware of. This isn't something that I will, grade you down on at this point because you're just submitting drafts. And also just to emphasize, this isn't coming from me noticing this in particular, but I just wanted to mention this because it's a good idea. So the first part of this is citations. And so citations are sometimes, although not really at the kind of advanced level here, the 400 level, but sometimes citations are a little bit confusing for people. So you have to cite facts that are not commonly known, but that means stuff that's facts but are kind of widely known, like the sky is blue, or maybe the United States is a wealthy nation. Those sorts of things don't really need to be cited. Mainly because most people know it. But not everybody knows something like Venezuela's inflation rate is the highest it has been since 1992, or Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil in 2013, canceled a state visit, delayed a state visit to the United States. Right? These things might not be widely known and should be cited. So you have to cite things that are facts but aren't commonly known, and then you also have to cite anything that you paraphrase in terms of actual text in a source or the arguments of a source, so the kind of ideas presented in another source. Something like, so in the 1980s, the global community got together and banned and phased out chlorofluorocarbons, which were causing a hole in the ozone layer and increasing rates of skin cancer in animals and people. And so we got together and banned that. And maybe you're reading a paper and it's talking about the role of Latin America in CFCs, banning CFCs. And the paper says that Latin American governments, especially those in Chile and Argentina, were very concerned. And that's not a widely known piece of information, so it should be cited. But it also is maybe an argument or a piece of information from that paper. And you might say, well, don't want to quote it word for word, perhaps, but you do want to paraphrase it and say, well, nations in the southern cone of South America were very concerned about CFCs and participated strongly in the Montreal Protocol of the 1980s. You want to cite that source that said that. In terms of sources, make sure you spend a bit of time looking for sources before you give up. So, yeah, you might have an argument that you want to make in your paper, but you should spend a little bit of time figuring out the sources that can support that argument, or maybe even provide a counterpoint that you could argue against. I can find sources if they exist in most cases. You should put the effort into doing that. But if you have a question on like what's the best way to search for sources, how can I find things, please email me and I'll put together a kind of a how-to video that's maybe specific to your issue, but maybe could be useful to others. Finally, I'd like to kind of just prompt you to think about what plagiarism is. Now, plagiarism can be a lot of different things. It can include turning in someone else's work as your own, copying words or ideas from someone else without giving them credit, failing to put quotation marks around quotations. This is a weird one because most people are like, well, I cited it, but if it's word for word and you cited it but didn't put quotation marks around it, that's still plagiarism and just as bad of a violation, at least technically speaking, as presenting someone else's ideas as your own. Plagiarism can also include giving incorrect information about the source of a quotation, so misattribution. Changing words but copying the sentence structure of a source without giving credit is another one that's pretty common. And then also copying so many words or ideas from a source that it makes up the majority of your work, whether you give credit or not. So that's one that causes people problems. You can't submit a paper that's basically quotations or basically 100% from one source or even multiple sources. You should be contributing something as well, something of your own information. The biggest thing, though, for plagiarism is you can avoid it by citing your sources. And remember, plagiarism can result in pretty steep penalties, including ejection from the university. So just be careful, okay? If you have a question, don't hesitate to ask. I'm here to help you with that. All right. Enough about that. I'm sure that citation, sources, and plagiarism won't be a problem for anybody, but to do due diligence, I wanted to make sure I mentioned it. All right, so talking about biodiversity and environmental protection, we've covered some of this before. Now, in the classroom, if I teach this class, I would have people kind of shout out the concerns that we might have. And, a lot of times we talk about pollution, we talk about resource use, we talk about deforestation, we talk about habitat loss, we talk about, over-industrialization, urbanization, perhaps we talk about some social equity issues. And a lot of this kind of boils down to habitat change, because urbanization causes habitat change. Industrial pollution, let's say, causes habitat change. Climate change causes habitat change. Deforestation causes habitat change. And so it all kind of boils down to habitat change, which in large parts of Latin America, including southern Mexico, the highland parts of Central America, the upland but not quite top of the Andes, the upland area of the Andes, and the Amazon basin, are all significant forest areas. So this habitat change often boils down to deforestation. A lot of this, and that's why we're going to focus on it a little bit today, but the other part of it is biodiversity loss. And, biodiversity, just like globalization, it's another buzzword. And it's one that you probably hear more so often that it starts to lose meaning. But let's discuss what it really is. It's a buzzword, and it has to do with a rise in environmental awareness starting, like a lot of our contemporary social movements, in the late 1960s. And since then, it's gained strength, and it even today is gaining strength with concerns around the globe about climate change and environmental degradation in general. So basically, the word means what's up here. It's the diversity of plant and animal life as represented by the number of extant species. And that definition comes from the Oxford English Dictionary. But if we boil it down even more, it's basically the number of plants, insects, animals, microorganisms, etc. found in any one location. The term's pretty recent. It was first used in 1986 at a conference, and then it was widely used in print starting the next year, 1987. What biodiversity means for Latin America, though, is sometimes not clear, but the region is one of the most biodiverse areas on Earth. If we actually look at, the biodiversity kind of distribution around Earth, We can see here we have Latin America, and right down the backbone of the highlands of Central America and the Andes, and then also the coastal zones of Brazil, and then finally the Amazon and the Caribbean. All these areas have very high levels of biodiversity. In fact, some of the highest in the world. Compare that to North America or Europe. Diversity is low. Australia, diversity is only high on the coasts. The only areas that really compete with Latin America are parts of Africa, and then Southeast Asia for sure is very biodiverse. So typically, though, in Latin America, for every 10 square kilometers, you'll find between 1,000 and over 5,000 species. So that's individual species. Could be plants, could be animals, could be birds, could be worms, could be insects. There are other parts of the globe known for their biodiversity, and I kind of pointed those out. We call these areas with high biodiversity hotspots. Now, you might notice that this map shows only species numbers of vascular plants, and in fact, that's what the 1,000 to 5,000 number in Latin America refers to. So these would be plants that photosynthesize. But the pattern of biodiversity is very similar of overall biodiversity is very similar to that of plants. If the environment can support many plants, it supports many of the other organisms that focus around plants, whether they be predators that eat things that eat plants or things that eat plants themselves. So the pattern, the kind of take-home message here is that the pattern of biodiversity is pretty similar for all species. So really the numbers between 1,000 and over 5,000 species per 10 square kilometers in Latin America, they're much higher overall. So why focus on biodiversity in Latin America really at all? Why would we consider it important? Well, one big reason is that we focus about it in Latin America because we have very high levels of biodiversity. So 10 to 20% of all species on Earth can be found in Latin America, with close to all of those being represented by birds and insects, right? So that's crazy. The proportion globally is the same, though. So you might think, all right, 10 to 20% of all species, almost all of those are birds and insects. Man, is it just that lots of bugs and birds chill out in Latin America? Well, yes, but lots of birds and bugs chill out everywhere in the world. Almost 100% of all life on Earth is really made up of bugs and birds. Latin America is part of what we call the neotropics. And ecologists and biogeographers use this term neotropics as kind of the New World tropical areas. And they're made up of the Amazon and then Middle and Central American forests. But we can really call it Latin America and the Caribbean. It's pretty accurate. It also includes parts of Florida, though. But it doesn't include highland Mexico. But for the purpose of this class, when we talk about Latin America, we'll call it the neotropics. Neotropical rainforests, though, are among the most biodiverse places on Earth, with the Amazon taking the cake. So 1/3 of all species in the world can be found in the Amazon. So that's, over 33% of all species on Earth. 1 square kilometer of land in the Amazon can have as many as 75,000 different types of trees and over 150,000 types of plants. But that 150,000 types of plants would actually include the 75,000 species of trees. Overall, 438,000 plants of human economic interest have been registered for the Amazon. That doesn't include the stuff that people wouldn't care about. So in, say North America, a plant of human economic interest could include something like corn, obviously, but also something that maybe like nettle, right? Stinging nettle. It actually, you can make it into a pretty tasty tea. And so that could be possibly of human economic interest. But plenty of plants aren't, like perhaps milkweed isn't really a very economically interesting plant here in the U.S. Maybe poison ivy would be one that's not of economic interest, so that wouldn't count on the similar list for the U.S. So that's almost just over 438,000 plants that could be economically beneficial in the Amazon alone. The thing though that people don't pay attention to a lot about Latin America is that Central and Middle American forests are quite diverse and environmentally important too. But because I'm a lover of the Amazon and do work there, we're going to focus on the Amazon today. Now, one of the problems with kind of biodiversity in Latin America is actually preserving it. And it's a big problem overall because we have some difficulty really enforcing the rules that already exist. However, before we get into before we get into what's going on in the Amazon, let's talk about this environmental protection a little bit more. So there are two basic paradigms, and they're not the same. In fact, they're really, really different. Even in this country, we've got a lot of debate between conservationists, so folks who are into conservation, and preservationists when we talk about the use of natural resources. So conservation here and in Latin America or anywhere else occurs when areas are set aside to be used responsibly or in a limited fashion by people. So protection is from overuse, not from the use of the area by people at all. You can still use it. You can even harvest it, like say cut down trees or extract non-timber products from a forest that was conserved. But there's limitations to use, so you don't overuse the resource. Preservation is the other side of the coin. It's what happens when an area is set aside for almost no use at all for people. So, though environmental protection, as we're all used to hearing about it, is pretty Western in nature, meaning European and North American in its idea or in its origin, intellectual origin, preservation is very much a Western idea. And it began with the British colonial land ethic, which paradoxically led land that was naturally like human landscapes from Europe to be preserved because they reminded the English of their farms and fields. So in other words, the reason why we have Yellowstone National Park is not only because it's a natural monument, it has pretty amazing landscapes, but because parts of it really reminded people of European descent of the idyllic, pastoral, human-dominated landscapes of upper-class Britain. And this is a pretty well-documented phenomena. It's the same reason why we all have lawns around our homes instead of vegetable gardens, is because we're all kind of emulating this cultural touchstone of British wealthy people from the post-colonial era. It's totally weird. If you're interested in learning more about that history, I've got some interesting references. Just shoot me an email. But anyway, preservation is a pretty Western idea, but conservation is not so Western. In Latin America, conservation is pretty much what most Native American groups did when their land with their land resources before Europeans arrived. But there are some exceptions, like the Maya and the Inca, who modified their environments and sometimes had some problems. Like the Maya, in drought, their civilization collapsed, and the Inca had some problems with this as well. All right. Overall, though, when we look around the world, when we talk about Latin American biodiversity and environmental protection, we have to put the Latin American environments in a global context. So globally, there are 3,869 million hectares of forest. Hectare is a land area measurement, a metric measurement that's equivalent to about 2.2 acres. And so that those 3,869 million hectares of forests account for about 30% of Earth's land area. And you can see them. They're at the high northern latitudes in North America, the Amazon, high northern latitudes in Europe and Asia, some here in the Congo, and then Southeast Asia as well. About 47% of those 3.8 billion, really, hectares of forests are tropical. So that would be they're in the tropics. So the equator comes through right around here, and those for about just less than half are tropical. 9% of the 3.8 billion hectares is subtropical, and about 11% is temperate. So temperate forests would be here, subtropical would be sort of close to the tropics but not, and then 33% of those are boreal, meaning that they are hot from the high north or low south, right? Very high latitudes. By the way, the boreal as a forest type name, it's actually derived from the god of the north wind in Greek mythology, whose name is Boreas. Most forests that are boreal are actually in Russia and Canada, where, of course, Greek is not really spoken. But anyway, it kind of taps into Greek mythology. And notice, though, that the most significant chunk of closed forest in Latin America is the Amazon, right? So, the Amazon is the most extensive standing tropical forest of the world, and it is important because it has high biodiversity, it has significant cultural wealth, it provides environmental services important to the globe, it contributes to global climate regulation, and it has a tenuous future. So it's been, over the last 30 years or so, cut down at a pretty startling rate. And most of these items, though, hold true for other forests in the world. So when you learn about some of the threats to the Amazon, a lot of them can be extended to cover, the Congo or the forests of Southeast Asia as well. Now, most people's initial reaction to deforestation in the Amazon is, oh my goodness, this is a disaster. But there's some problems with the idea of deforestation, and a big part of the problem comes from the fact that there's a lot of disagreement with what deforestation actually is. So if we look at two references that are important in deforestation in the Amazon, we have a little bit of confusion, right? So Rudell et al. In 2001 wrote that tropical deforestation is the conversion of primary forests by anthropogenic, that would be human, activities for the development of agriculture and cattle raising. They were working in Latin America, by the way. This definition does not include areas of forest affected by selective logging or wildfires. Okay. Example 2, from kind of roughly the same time period. In a more quantitative definition, deforestation is the process of conversion of forest areas into other land uses where the canopy cover is reduced to 10% or less, and forest regeneration is not ongoing. So note, the FAO definition doesn't include selective logging or any mention of very common agricultural strategies in tropical forests like slash and burn agriculture. And, look, Rudell says that deforestation only applies to uncut primary forests where the destination land use after deforestation is agriculture or cattle ranching. And it doesn't include logging. So that's not a type of deforestation, is just logging to get wood and then you let the forest grow back. That's not deforestation somehow. And then the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization, says that